Dr. Josh Rasmussen, author of Who Are You Really? A Philosopher's Inquiry into the Nature and Origin of Persons. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
We are going to take a look at the philosophical implications of my current favorite TV show, Severance. Season 2 finale just happened and it was awesome. And I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything, so that to not have any spoilers here, but it might come up that some spoilers are just too relevant to the philosophical questions, but I'll do my best. And in any case, you should have all watched it by now, so we should be good. So the key part we're focusing on is that in Severance, the central premise involves a radical technology, a chip that's implanted into your brain such that you don't remember anything from your workday. So that from the perspective of you entering the elevator to go to your work floor, you blink at 9 a.m. at the beginning of the workday, and all of a sudden it's 5 p.m. and you have no memories of what transpired while you were actually on the floor. They call it the severed floor. But conversely, from the perspective of you on the inside, they call that the innie, and then the person on the outside is called the outie. From the perspective of the innie, when they enter that elevator from the floor to leave, say at 4:59 p.m., they blink and it becomes 9 a.m. So, and they have no memories of anyone on the outside. Given these two different streams of memory, as the season progresses, as the story progresses, the question left to the viewer is, are we dealing with two different people? Because given their memories or their lack thereof, they develop different projects, different goals, and eventually different characters. But yet you still want to say you're dealing with one person here, right? Or not. So that's what we're looking at. I see the TV show Severance as implicating at least two sets of philosophical issues: personal identity, what it is for one thing to persist and be the same thing over time, and the mind-body problem, how mind relates to body, and so on. So we'll begin with questions of personal identity. This encompasses a family of related philosophical issues, but the most pertinent one for us is the persistence question. What does it take for you to persist from one time to the next? Why is it that when I look in a yearbook and see a picture of me from kindergarten, that person is me, but nobody else in the yearbook is me? It's one way of getting at the question. So before looking at the particular issues raised by Severance, Josh, what is your answer to the persistence question? What is it for me in particular, personal identity of a person to endure from one time to another?
I love this question, Miles, because it really helps us to think about an even bigger question, which is what inspired me to write this book, Who Are You Really? Which just has to do with like, what kind of a being am I most fundamentally? And there are different answers to this question, that have stakes for your future. So, like, one answer, for example, would be a kind of mindless, bottom up, mindless materialist view, where the basic ingredients of what you are little bits of mindless matter, particles arranged in a certain way, and then that's what you are. Now, on that particular theory of what you are, that's going to have implications for how you persist from moment to moment. I mean, on some views, you wouldn't even be able to persist through any kind of change through your internal parts because your identity itself is just constituted by whatever those parts are. So if the parts are swapped out, it's unclear how you could be the same person. Now, there are different solutions to this, but if you have this frame that you're made up out of mindless bits of matter, that's going to have implications. But there are other theories about what make you you. And so this show, Severance, is kind of playing on our intuitions about, well, are you you if you have the same personality? What if you change personalities? Can you change personalities over time and still be you? Or what if you have two different people, but they both have the same personality? Does that mean they're the one and the same person? I mean, like, imagine you have a twin and they have the same personality, or maybe somebody with a very different body, but they develop the same character, the same personality. So right away, I think it is helpful to distinguish between two things: the type of thing that you are, and the particular thing that you are. Okay, so there's the type of thing that you are, which would be the set of all your properties, and then there's a particular thing, which is the thing that has those properties. So you and I could have a lot of similarity in terms of the type of thing we are. We could even, in principle, have all the same properties, and yet we'd still be different beings. I mean, you'd be over there with your thoughts, I'd be over here. Even if I'm having the same type of thoughts, I would still be a different individual instantiating that type. So now this is relevant to the question of that show, because that show is focusing on, you might think, um, playing with the personality, or the type. The personalities start to diverge. But there's this idea that, well, it's the same being that has these different sets of personalities at different times. It's because they don't have access to their memories that their personalities are altered. So there's the version of that one being that is, in the elevator, the version of the being, I guess, that's outside the elevator. And those two different versions have two different types, or states, properties, even if it's the same being. And I think that's just an important distinction, because you could be the same being and undergo different types, different personalities. In principle, you could change your personality. So, to answer your question, my theory, before I can kind of like give you what's my account of personal identity, I find it helpful to think through different accounts and then kind of tell you why I don't accept the main account. And then I'll tell you what my account is.
Excellent. I think the most natural first view to consider is the one that's often attributed to John Locke, that our memories are what account for our identity over time. So, like, roughly put, I am the same person as I was in kindergarten because I share the same memories. I remember being that person. So there's this kind of unbroken continuity of memory. And you can spell that out in more precise ways. You could say it's about the right causal relationships between memories. So as long as there's memory overlap, but it all comes back to that particular psychological state that is the connection, your memories. On this view, on its face anyway, it would suggest that in the case of Severance, the innie and the outie are two people, because they have completely different memories, and no memories from the outie transfer or cause memories in the innie, and vice versa. So that initially, when I started watching the series and when I heard about John Locke's view, I was like, this is ridiculous. But as you see these either aspects of the same person or two people diverge in so many different ways, to the point that it culminates in this dramatic moment in the season finale, and I won't tell you what happens, where you make pivotal and distinct life or death decisions. You begin to wonder whether or not there's some plausibility to this account. Like, they want different things, they make different choices, they fall in love with different people. So what do you make of this relatively simplistic account of identity over time?
Yeah, I mean, it might actually kind of appeal to how we might treat somebody from the outside, as being the same or different, versus how we might think of ourselves from the inside. Now, in the case where you're losing your memories, that you don't really have access to remembering yourself, even from the inside. So you have a kind of epistemic gap, or a problem of how to know that you're the same person. I mean, like, for example, you could have maybe a video of this person that is you, but you don't recognize it as you because you don't even remember them, with that video. So yeah, so the memory view is associated with the psychological continuity view, memory being a form of psychology, where as long as you have sort of enough of the same memories. Now, I mean, technically, you don't have to have exactly all the same memories, because like every single moment, your memories are getting updated, and most people aren't going to say that you're just literally replaced with a new person, moment by moment. I mean, I'm not talking about the type changing. I'm talking about the token individual being replaced, just because you have a different memory each moment. You're getting more memories. So usually the idea is that as long as you have enough of the same memories, there's enough psychological continuity, then you count as being the same person. And again, I think this is kind of maybe useful if we sort of treat people from the outside, as being the same, because it's sort of, for practical purposes, we might sort of treat them as the same as long as they have enough of the same memories. But then, in the philosophy class, now we can start thinking, strictly speaking, are you actually the same person? And here's a worry that comes up for the psychological continuity view, and it has to do with the problem of the transitivity of identity. So to draw this out, according to kind of a strict identity, if A is identical with B and B is identical with C, then the identity is transitive, meaning that it follows that A is identical with C. This is the identity being one of the same as. So, if like if I am one and the same as Joshua Rasmussen, and Joshua Rasmussen is one and the same as a newly hired philosophy professor at Baylor, those designations pick one and the same person, okay, then the identity is transitive across those um, descriptions. Now, the memory view is problematic because even if you get that you have enough of the same memories from today as you had yesterday, and from yesterday as the day before, you follow the path, and eventually throughout the course of your life, you could stray in your memories more and more, just bit by bit, so that someone from early childhood has vastly different memories than that person has like way later in life, so that they don't count as continuous. But you can see then the identity is not transitive there, because each link is enough of the same. It's roughly identical, like roughly enough of the same memories. But then that rough turns into too far away. You lose the identity there. So it looks like the kind of identity here, it can't be the sort of strict identity, because that strict identity is transitive. So this convinces me that even if there's some other sense of identity where you say your identity, you could say, you kind of you have some kind of identity with your memories. That's not the kind of strict philosophical identity, which is a transitive relation.
Okay, so here's the traditional objection to the memory view is that you as a child might have enough psychological continuity with you at 20, and you at 20 so you'll have enough psychological continuity to count as the same person. And you at 20 might have enough psychological continuity with you at 75 to count as the same person. But if there's been enough memory change or degradation over your life, you won't have enough memory continuity, psychological continuity of you at 75 with you at 5 as a child to count those as identical. But as you say, identity has to be transitive. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, A has to be identical to C.
Yeah,
That's the objection, right?
that's it. Yeah, and that's a case where it looks like the criteria would say that you're not identical, even though the way we sort of ordinarily think of personal identity, we would say that you are still the same person, um, as long as you have slow changes over time. Um, you don't have that strict identity. There's another objection that goes at it from the other direction, where um, you have this transporter experiment, where I want to describe this, where it looks like um, you actually have the same psychology, but you don't count as identical. And so this is where you get onto a transporter, and it's going to transport you to the planet. This is the sci-fi transporter, where it destroys all of your atoms, but then creates a duplicate of you on the planet. So you're a little bit nervous, and the transporter guy says, "Well, this always works. We've never had a problem." So you get onto the transporter, and they press the buttons or whatever, and then there's a guy created on the planet with all of your memories, all of your psychology, so they count as you. And this is fine. I mean, you yourself like have those memories. You're like, oh, good, phew, it worked. And so you keep transporting. You're using the transporter for years and years, and then you take one of your friends with you, and your friend is a little bit nervous, and you convince them, and he's like, I've been using this all my life, right? Well, this is the special day where there is a problem. So on this day, you get into the transporter, and it does successfully duplicate you on the planet. So there's a body on the planet with all of your mind, all of your psychology, all of your memories, but it fails to destroy the body on the transporter. And so the body on the transporter still exists, still has all of your memories, all of your psychology, right? But now, like, which one is actually you? Well, according to identity theory, because again, I make sure this is very clear, we're not just talking about being the same type. We're talking about being the same one individual token. So the person on the planet has your same memories, exactly your same memories, same as the one on the transporter. I mean, I guess the memories start diverging, but up to that moment, they're all the same. And so, well, which one is really you? And the psychological continuity view just can't answer that question. It's indeterministic with respect to that. It looks like the one that's you is not determined just by your psychology. They can't both be you, because there's two and there's only one you, right? So they could be
Mm.
both the same type. They can't both be the same individual token.
Well, I had a response to the first objection, but the second seems pretty decisive because
The
it would
second
seem
one's
like,
harder, I think. Yeah, I'd love to hear
yeah.
your response to the first one. Yeah,
Well, the first one that the response I've read is to adopt a more nuanced version of the psychological continuity view to say that it's not so much continuity between the contents of the memories from one stage of your life to the other that preserves identity, but to have the proper causal relationships between the relevant psychological state, in this case, memory. And so, on that view, they could possibly, anyway, maintain the identity of the very old version of myself and the very young version of myself because there is something of an unbroken causal chain between the mental states of that individual, those two phases of the individual. So, on that account, even though the contents of the memories differ, they have the right causal relationships to one another to count as the same
that's
person.
good. You add to the memory view a kind of causal network, and then that's one way in general you can kind of work on these theories is sort of add more complexity to the account, and that can provide a more sophisticated defense. So yeah, that's a nice point there. Yeah, and in my book, I don't even give. Well, I don't remember. I don't focus on the transitivity problem so much. What I really focus on is that transporter experiment problem. I might have mentioned the transitivity problem. I'm not sure, um, but it's the transporter experiment problem that I will just admit kind of convinces me. I mean, it was just like when I heard that, I was like, yeah, I mean, that seems right. It seems like that helps to expose that having enough of the same psychology, that has to do with being enough of the same type of person. That's identity across a type, but it doesn't really account for the identity of the token individual.
I think it's a powerful thought experiment because while initially it's like a bait and switch. Initially, you hear the transporter phenomenon and you say, well, are you the same individual even though it's different atoms, but there's the same psychological state? Okay, maybe. But then you hear the variation put on it and you go, oh, there's just no way that that person is you. And if it's not you when the body isn't destroyed, it's not you when the body is destroyed. That doesn't seem to be the right sort of thing that would change
Right.
this fact about
Yeah.
identity.
And the way to know who is you is not to find out kind of from the third person and do a philosophical analysis. It's actually like to be the person, right? So you find yourself on the planet and you're like, well, I'm here over here. I'm the one that's here. Maybe I was somehow on the transporter before. Maybe there's been a split. So there's like now two beings. Who knows how that works? But the point is that you have access through first person introspection to being you that from the outside, it's kind of a matter of speculation, theorizing. So there's the epistemic gap problem. Like, well, how do we know which one is you? Okay, that's a problem, but there still is a fact of the matter. Like, well, which one is you? Okay, or there is no fact of the matter. I mean, just to cover all my options, either there is a fact of the matter or there isn't a fact of the matter. But the answer to whether or not there's a fact of the matter is not determined just by the psychology of the situation.
Mm. Okay, so that to me is pretty decisive against the psychological continuity view. What's an alternative? There would be the animalism view. That might be a more specific case of the kind of
Of the body
brute
view. Yeah.
physical continuity that
Yeah, right.
one version of which is having the same brain over time. That's the seat of identity. What would some of those views be?
So there's a cluster of related, yeah, well, you're pointing to I call it just the body view that you're the same individual if you have the same body. Now, it's interesting because the way this is often kind of discussed in a dialectical context or even in a classroom context, when I was taking courses in the philosophy of mind, this is how my professors would present this topic of identity. They would start with the body view, and then they would challenge the body view with different thought experiments like, let's just imagine that your atoms are replaced with my atoms, like one by one over time, so that I get your original atoms, and they even slowly my body starts to even look more and more like your original body. But I maintain my own psychology. And then the idea is like, well, where do I go? Do I go with the body or do I go with the psychology? Or you have these experiments, these thought experiments. You imagine, especially in sci-fi, like to play with these ideas where you have a psychology take over somebody's body as a host, and then it's like, I am whatever, I represent this Goa'uld, and I'm actually took over this body, and the feeling is like that there's a new person there that's taking over the body, and that the psychology is relevant to your identity. And so then usually these sort of psychological objections to the body view lead to the psychological continuity view, right? Then we argue against the psychological continuity view, and that takes us back to want to think again about the body view. Um, but let me just say that for me, in my analysis of the body view, I focus on a series of replacement puzzles. These are puzzles having to do with, like, well, which of the clouds of atoms that are overlapping? Because right here, this body, you see it, it feels like it's one unified thing from a distance. But if you zoom in, you have like mostly empty space and just like particles and fields. And you've got these overlapping clouds of particles. And well, which of the many overlapping clouds of particles counts as me? Literally me. And there's this demarcation problem, like which one is me, especially if you recognize that from the inside, you can be aware of yourself having a thought, having a feeling, raising your hand, even while atoms inside of you are being replaced. Outside of your awareness, you're not aware of the replacement of atoms, but these atoms are being replaced, and you can get the knowledge that you don't have the same atoms from moment to moment. So then, where is your identity tied? Like, what makes you you if there's no particular atoms that make you you? Now, maybe there's some kind of whole organism that makes you you, but then again, is it the arrangement of the atoms? Like, what is it? Um, and some philosophers who are animalists, they will say there's actually nothing about the physical description of you that determines which one is you. Um, they'll Trent Merrick's, for example, he defends a kind of, I would say, an animalist view where you're integrated with the body, and then what you are, what makes you you, is not going to be explained in terms of physical facts about you. So maybe it's just basic or primitive, what makes you you. But the body view is not accounting for what makes you you. We can't say you are that particular body because that body is the same body. It's like, well, what makes that body the same body if it's replacing its atoms? It's kind of like it pushes the question back a step. Like, if what makes you the same is that you have the same body, well, what makes your body the same across time? That the question still remains.
So is this an issue arising from vagueness concerns, like the vague physical boundaries of a physical object? Like if we zoom
That's
in on any
yeah,
physical object with enough granularity, it's very unclear which atoms are going to count as the object and which are going to count as the environment. And there are innumerable groupings within a certain range that seem to have equal claim to being the object itself. Is that right?
yeah. So there's this kind of vague boundary problem, and part of the problem here is that there doesn't seem to be a principled answer to which of the many clouds of atoms are the ones that make you you. Especially when for any clouds of atoms, those atoms could be replaced, and you could still persist, or at least according to sort of a first person self awareness account. It seems like you could be aware of yourself having thoughts, having feelings, and that awareness doesn't seem to consist of awareness of any particular particles, and that fits with this kind of vagueness problem. I mean, the vagueness problem is one of several different problems. So there is a problem of the vague boundaries, or there being no principled way of isolating which of those things are you or make you you. So that's one problem. A different problem, which is still related, is the problem of um, when you replace your parts, then it seems like you continue to exist, but then there's no way of saying what makes you you if you can have different parts. It's related to replacement, but I mean it's related to the vagueness issue. But the vagueness issue is something that comes up like right now at this moment, even without replacing your parts. It's sort of vague, like which of the many atoms makes you you at this moment. But then I think there's an additional problem that as you replace your atoms, um, those imagine your original atoms. This is kind of like the Theseus's ship problem. It's like that ship. There's a ship that Theseus owns, and then the planks of the ship get replaced. The old planks get reassembled to the shape and form of the original ship, and then it's like, well, now does he have, which ship is his ship? Um, And I think that that's sort of a problem when you talk about ships that have to do with our conventions for treating something as the same for the sake of possession. Like, do I possess that or not? Or is that mine or not? Um, but when it comes to our existence, I don't think it's just a matter of our conventions, whether we exist. I mean, we could debate that, but I think that I exist, I have self awareness, and I think that I also persist. I continue from moment to moment. And so it's not a matter of convention that I exist or that I persist, in my view. But then if that's right, then what happens if my atoms are replaced with new atoms? If my original atoms are assembled to be just like this body, you know, to be like a duplicate, well, then it's like the transporter problem all over again, because now we've got two duplicate bodies arranged in the exact same way, and yet only one of them is actually me. Um, this is sort of symmetrical to the psychological duplication, except now we just have body duplication. It seems like what makes me me isn't mere psychological states nor physical arrangement. It seems like there's something else that makes me me.
So let's make things a bit more concrete under this physical understanding of what accounts for continuity over time. And let's say that we're proposing that I am identical to my brain. I am my brain, fundamentally speaking. Well, then this first objection concerns my existence, the existence of the brain at a time. How do we specify what collection of atoms within the vicinity of the brain is the brain and which are not? It seems entirely arbitrary. Well, I think that's a general problem for identity conditions and persistence conditions of any material object. It's just a general problem of mereology, of how do we specify what parts are actually part of a thing. And most people wouldn't conclude then that every physical thing is merely conventional. Like the brain, for example, even if you're a substance dualist that thinks that you are an immaterial soul, you still think there is such a thing as a brain, these problems of vagueness notwithstanding. So it seems to me that whatever solution you adopt to the general problem of persistence over time for material objects, you could just adopt here. And then when it comes to the second problem, again, if you think there is such a thing as the brain, as I think most of us would, you might not know what to say about the case of the brain being replaced atom by atom and then reconstituted somewhere else. Okay, which one is the real brain, the original brain? I don't know what to say to that, but I still think there's such a thing as a brain that endures over time and is just a physical object. So, why is it okay to maintain my belief in brains, but I should see these as reasons to reject the view that I am the brain?
This is very interesting. I'm glad you brought this up, because a number of philosophers who are studying this sort of question of artifacts or objects that we sort of treat as unified wholes. We treat chairs and stars and brains as unified wholes. Um, they become puzzled over like the demarcation between which objects are really there versus which ones are not. So, most people, if we're going to sort of appeal to ordinary common sense intuitions, are not going to think that there's an object that consists of, just this handle plus my left nostril. Those are the two parts, and that's it. That's like a handle nostril object, right? No, you could think that there is such an object. I mean, actually, in my dissertation, I was defending this sort of universalist, mereological universalist idea that for any two entities, there's the combination of those entities. And I appealed to that for reasons that had to do with truth making. And so I thought I need all those objects. And also because, to be honest, I was very preoccupied with and worried about the demarcation problem. The demarcation problem is, how do you demarcate that there's not an object that consists of, this handle plus my left nostril, but there is the object that consists of this handle plus, the rest of the cup. There's the cup here. That object exists. Um, and I mean, our common sense kind of pulls against itself a little bit. It's like, commonsensically, it seems like, well, there is a cup, and commonsensically, it seems like there's not a nostril handle object. But then commonsensically, it seems like you could slowly come up with examples between the nostril handle and the cup, and there's not really a demarcation that says, okay, categorically there's an object here and there's not an object here. Really, what makes the difference? So philosophers are very split on this. Some philosophers are nihilists. They say, well, technically, really, there are just things arranged in different ways, but there's not, in addition to those things arranged in different ways, these combination objects. Others go the universalist route and say, well, every entity composes something, and every entity is make an object. And then others are restrictivists who try to say, well, there's some way of saying some of these objects exist and some of these don't. Let me just say that my own view, it's been in transition over the last 15 years since I first kind of worried about this. I've really got worried about it. It's like, wait, I don't understand. I don't understand. Like, there's no tower noses, but there, how do you demarcate the things? And my current working view is that, well, I think we actually do just treat objects for the sake of purposes as if they're really there, whether or not they actually are. So, it's okay in ordinary language to talk as if there's a cup here. I mean, I'm not speaking falsely if I say there are cups, because we have a convention, and according to that convention, there are cups. It's sort of like, if I say that, according to the Superman series, Lois likes Clark Kent, or Lois gets a little bit confused about whether Clark Kent is Superman and then discovers, that they're the same or something. That's like true according to that story. It's true according to our conventions to treat these objects as existing. And when we're getting around for practical purposes, we're not thinking philosophically about, well, I mean, is it that there's particles arranged cupwise? And in addition, there's this other entity that called the cup that contains those particles, but not the cup nose. It sounds like that gets beyond the practical use of our language, and so we don't really specify that according to the convention. It's sort of like if you ask, is there an even number of stars in the star? I mean, in the Superman series, is there an even number of stars? It's like it's not part of the series to specify whether there's an even number of stars or an odd number of stars. I mean, it's not even determined. So the story doesn't determine that. And I guess my view, to be honest, is just that yeah, our conventions don't determine whether Theseus's ship is the same if all the planks are replaced. That's why we have the puzzle, and some conventions maybe suggest that it is, and others suggest that it isn't. But if you sort of you add up all the conventions together, you don't really get a clear answer to that. So, I mean, that's where I might be tempted to say maybe that's what we should say about persons. That we just have conventions. People have conventions for treating people as if they exist and persist, but they don't really. They're just atoms arranged in a certain way or psychological bundles. But there's not, in addition, real enduring selves. So that's what I want is I would want to say, to be consistent, that there are conventions for treating us as enduring selves, but we don't actually exist. However, I don't say that because here's why. I think that it makes sense to treat artifacts like cups and tables and chairs according to our conventions. But I think that I have access to myself through introspective awareness that convinces me that I actually do exist. Like I'm not just a posit for practical purposes. I'm actually a real being, and I'm aware of myself persisting from moment to moment. I can recall myself, me, the same sense of me. Now, this doesn't have to be infallible. There could be a kind of fallibility. Memories can get confused, but at least like in this moment, I'm aware of myself having one thought and then another thought, and I think that kind of self-awareness gives me evidence that I'm real, and that I continue to persist. And so I don't apply this sort of conventional analysis to myself. And I think that that's a difference between myself and artifacts. Artifacts are things out there. In a way, it's almost like I'm projecting agency, not really like personal agency, but like a unification, because I'm a unified being. So I'm projecting that kind of unification out there and treating the cup as unified because it serves my purposes, even if there isn't literally, in addition to the particles, like some other entity out there. So that's my working hypothesis to kind of explain all the data of our language.
So you would be a mereological nihilist about material objects, the view that there really are no composite objects. There's only fundamental particles arranged in different ways, at least with respect to material objects. You'd affirm that view.
I just want to be very careful because I want to say yes, but I want to have a caveat to that.
Mm,
As long as we're being very clear that we're not using the language of our conventions, because the language of our conventions is so
mm.
ordinary and part of common sense that I want to say, with my advisor Peter Vandenwagen, when I was studying under him, he said he's sort of
Ah,
famous,
okay.
right? Yeah, he's famous for saying there are no tables and chairs.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I wasn't convinced while I was a student of his view until actually after I was no longer a student. So, and just thinking about the convention. So I want to just be very clear here. He thinks it's true that there are tables and chairs, even though he's notorious. People think that he thinks there are no tables and chairs, but no, that's a mistake. He thinks there are. In ordinary language, when you say there are tables and chairs, that's coming out true. Um, it's just that he thinks you can paraphrase that. So when you're saying there are tables and chairs, what you're saying is that there's particles arranged chair-wise, particles arranged, table-wise. So he can give sort of a paraphrase. Um, Now, I'm not so sure about those paraphrases, but I do think there's a kind of conventionalist analysis, so that I will say, that there are actually tables and chairs. But now, if you pin me down, you say, okay, put aside the conventions, put aside our use of language for practical purposes. Do you think, let's say that there's, 1,000 particles and they're arranged in the shape of like a cup. Do you think that in addition to the 1,000 particles, there's this 1,001th object, the particles plus, that arrangement there? And then I want to say, nah, I think there's the arrangement as a type or an abstract um, structure that we can impose and is instantiated by the particles, but there's not another token object there that would be sort of a standalone object. That's more entities than I need. So I have a kind of Occam's razor approach. I'm going to posit as many entities as I need to explain all the data. I don't think I need this other um, kind of thing there. But I do think I exist, right? So that's the important difference. I do think, because I don't posit my existence. I think I can be self-aware that I exist. So yes, I guess strictly speaking, I'm sympathetic with the kind of nihilism, as long as we have those caveats in place.
Absolutely. I have great sympathies for that view. I remember in my master's degree having to take a unit on mereology and composition. And as I began reading the literature, I went, there's a field, a subfield of philosophy that looks at this? I mean, these are questions that a lot of people will think about. And often like children reflecting on things. At least I did when I was a kid. And I kind of just thought that that's all it ever was. I didn't know there was a whole discipline that rigorously assesses these views. But my relatively untutored opinion probably would align with yours. I can't see as as unintuitive as the view is that there are no composite objects, strictly speaking. I think every other view is even more unintuitive. So it's
But it
just the
might be
best of a
that
bad set of options.
I really hear you, and it might even be that it's unintuitive because we're trained by our conventions. So like it sounds wrong. It's like if somebody speaks with an accent, it's like it sounds wrong because we're trained with our conventions. But then if you really kind of understand what's at stake, and you just like imagine like these particles, and those particles are simultaneously describable by infinitely many descriptions. Any subset of those particles is describable by infinitely many descriptions. I mean, I got the intuition going the other way. It's like, wait, are you saying that only certain descriptions pick out certain subsets of the particles, and those subsets form real objects, but the other subsets don't? Like, I mean, it's just that seemed very weird. Like, why is it that, like, if the particles just happen to be arranged like into the shape of a smiley face, and if it's arranged just close enough to what we call smiley face, well, now there's also, in addition to those particles, a smile that exists ontologically above those particles. But if it's arranged into a form that we as humans don't really recognize, like a tower nose, like one of the examples in the literature. You talk about the subfield. Yeah, there's a subfield of philosophers of literature, and the tower nose is one of the famous examples. It's like, well, that doesn't exist in its own right. Well, yeah, because we don't think of tower noses as very useful for our purposes. It's almost like this striking coincidence that yeah, only the objects that are sort of useful for our purposes, those ones that actually exist out there. This seems like anthropomorphism to me. It seems very bizarre and unintuitive, actually, to have a kind of restricted view. It's like either all the things compose something, and that's the universalist view, which would be, I'm still kind of open to that for truth making reasons, or it's the nihilist view. But this sort of restricted view, that's a hard one for me to really justify. I mean, unless you're going to appeal to mind itself, as forming out these objects, but then the mind exists or the person exists. So yeah, so I don't think the persons are a matter of mere convention, but I think persons have the power to carve out objects by their conventions, by our conventions. Yeah,
Okay, good. I think that's a plausible view, and it serves as a response to my. It serves as a counter response to my response to your objections, which is to say we just accept the implication that the brain is not a thing, but we can't do that when it comes to people. Is basically the
you
point you're
got it.
making. So,
Yeah.
so then what uh, in the culmination of our conversation here on this topic, what accounts for personal identity over time then? If not psychological continuity, if not physical continuity of one kind, what
Okay.
is it?
Yeah. So here's a third view that I'm going to argue against. So the third, so
Okay.
the three main view, and then I'll tell you my view on this. So the three main views are, the body view, the psychological continuity view, and then the soul view, right? The mysterious, we give up, and so we have the soul of the gap sort of idea. We can't explain it, so posit the soul. So the idea is that you are the same person from moment to moment, not because you have the exact same body or even this exact same psychological states, but because there's this other thing that you are, which is an immaterial soul. That's the thing that carries your identity. That's the thing that grounds your identity. And so you maintain your identity from moment to moment by being this sort of special kind of thing. Okay, so that's the soul view. Um, Now, I think the soul view has advantages over the other views. I think that doesn't have this sort of replacement of parts problem, especially if you think of the soul as a kind of simple psychological unity that doesn't have separable, replaceable parts. Um, it allows for psychological states to change. So, in the transporter case, the reason that you could say that the person on the planet is not you is because even though they have all of your psychological states, or even if their states change or whatever, their soul is different than your soul. So they just have a different soul. So that's what makes them different than you. So I think the soul view does have advantages over these other views. However, I think there is still a problem of explaining your identity in terms of something that you call soul, and then you ask the question, well, what explains the identity of the soul from moment to moment? Um, it kind of kicks back the mystery. So, I mean, let me go back to the animalist idea. So some animalists will say, like Trent Merrick's, I think his view has been that there's a kind of primitive identity, where you're not going to explain your identity by saying you've got the same parts arranged in the same way. There's sort of a primitive, you just are the same from moment to moment. It's not in virtue of something else being the same, right? And yet you do have material parts. You are an organism, you're an animal, you're a physical being, let's say. You're a very special kind of physical being. You're not just built up piecemeal out of mindless parts. You're a very kind of special unity. Okay, so if you can say that in sort of in defense of the body view, that you're the same body, but it's not in virtue of any particular physical parts or physical properties. It's just you are just primitively the same. Then it's sort of unclear. And I hope this isn't too confusing because I'm talking about the body view, but I'm also talking about the soul view. If we talk about the soul being the same, the question is, in virtue of what is my soul today the same as my soul yesterday or tomorrow? What makes it the same? And if you say, well, it's just primitive, there's sort of no deeper explanation, then it's sort of unclear what work the soul is doing in explaining your identity. I mean, why do you need to explain your identity? Why can't it just be that you are just the same and there's no deeper explanation? Every view is going to bottom out in something that's primitively identical from moment to moment. I mean, like, just to draw this out, I mean, if you say, why is the number four the same number four today as it was yesterday? You say, oh, it's in virtue of the number four's soul. The number four has a soul. Okay. Well, then why is that soul the same from, does the soul have a soul? I mean, if you posit the soul to explain identity, why are you positing the soul? Like, if you say the soul is primitively identical, well, then why do you need a soul in the first place? Why can't the thing itself just be identical? So, I guess what I'm saying is that the soul view, to me, it seems like it avoids some of the problems of the body view and the psychological continuity views. I think it's better. It's a better solution than those views, because it avoids those problems. But it still sort of has its own problem, which has to do with just kicking back the question: what explains the soul's identity from moment to moment to moment? And so either you say, well, there is a deeper explanation, or you say there's no deeper explanation. If you say there's a deeper explanation, then you haven't really answered the question. What is that deeper explanation? Is it the soul's soul? I mean, what is it? If you say there's no deeper explanation, then you're already admitting, you're already granting that there can be an identity that's basic and primitive with no deeper explanation. Well, if that's true, then what do you need the soul for? Why not just say that you exist and you maintain identity from moment to moment, and there's no deeper explanation of your identity? Does that make sense? I mean, going back to Occam's razor, this is one of my worldview development tools. I want the simplest theory that can explain all my data. So it seems like I don't need to posit a soul to explain my identity. I mean, even if I have other reasons to think that I'm a soul or whatever, my identity doesn't need to be grounded in this something else that's identical in a primitive way. I'm just primitively the same, moment by moment by moment. So that would be my working solution. Really, would be to say there is no account, there is no deeper explanation of my identity. Rather, I just maintain my identity, and there's the nature of me is such that I can maintain my identity, even through the change of psychology and the change of particles. So I'm not fundamentally a body. I'm not fundamentally just a psychological sequence, or set of properties. I am something else. I'm what I call a substance, and I have identity from moment to moment. I'm a particular substance that's distinct from you, and I maintain my identity from moment to moment to moment. But there's no deeper explanation. There's not something else that sort of explains why I'm the same thing from moment to moment. I'm the thing that explains why I'm the same. I mean, I guess there's not really an explanation. It's just it bottoms out with me.
So I think it's right that any theory has to bottom out somewhere with bare identity over time, but that doesn't mean that all stopping points are equally plausible. It doesn't license you to end the chain of explanation wherever you want or wherever's most convenient for you. And it seems to me there's at least some reason to think that positing the soul as the bearer of identity with no deeper explanation is more plausible than doing so for a brain or body or a physical object, because physical objects are composite. They have parts and they're divisible. And that's what gives rise to the problems of identity at a time or over time, vague boundaries, and the problems of replacement. Whereas the soul is indivisible. It's a non-physical object with no parts at all. And so it's akin to the number four, like what accounts for the number four's identity over time. Well, four, if it's under standard accounts, if it really exists, is a non-physical object. It's immaterial. And so it doesn't have physical parts. And therefore, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of need to provide an explanation for its identity. And so you could just say the same thing about the soul in that case. If that's right, then taking the soul as a primitive bearer of identity doesn't lend a whole lot of credibility to the claim of the body as the physical object as that thing that has identity, because they're just not the same. The proposals are radically different.
Yeah, good summary. Yeah, so I agree 100% that the soul view does have advantages um, over those other views. And let me also make this clear, because I do say this in the book. I'm not saying that you aren't a soul. I'm not saying that the soul view doesn't have those advantages. What I'm saying is that I don't really need to posit a soul to explain my identity if I can just say that my identity is just basic, it's just primitive. There's no deeper explanation of my identity. Maybe it'd be useful to say that in order for there to be no deeper explanation of my identity, I need to be the kind of being that doesn't have these sort of problems of replacement or vague boundaries, or non-strict identity. So maybe that implies that I would have to be like a soul or something like this. Maybe that takes us to the same place. I prefer the term self, and the reason for that is because I think that I'm self-aware. So the word soul is sort of tricky. I mean, people talk about positing the soul as an immaterial, non-physical thing, whereas I don't think I posit my own existence. I think my existence is something that's disclosed to me by self-awareness. And that's a further question what I am. So maybe what we want to say is what I am is the kind of thing fundamentally that's not composed out of replaceable molecules or something. What I am is a soul, and that's the way that I can persist through change. But I don't need to use the words. I mean, maybe it's just a matter of definition. What do you mean by soul? I just say, well, what I am is me. Okay, I'm just me. And then what is that? Well, it's whatever it is that I'm aware of in self-awareness, and then that thing continues. That self continues. So I'm okay with saying the self is a soul as long as um, we understand that the word soul, we're not building in um, more than we need to on this account.
Right. So your view is compatible with our being a soul, but
Yes,
you would just say it's not in virtue of being a soul that accounts for our identity over time. Rather,
that's
our
it.
identity over time is just a basic facet of who we
You
are.
got it. You got it. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a good segue into a conversation about mind body dualism. So, severance is relevant to philosophical analysis of the human person in another respect. It implicates our views about the relationship between the mind and the body. Is the brain conscious or is my soul conscious? Or do they come together to create some sort of conscious experience? And I think the implication I see most directly from Severance as a thought experiment, anyway, is that it serves to reinforce a common argument for thinking that conscious experience, whatever the reality of a soul or immaterial self is, conscious experience depends necessarily upon a functioning brain or a functioning physical substratum of some sort. Because the whole premise of the show is that you can bring about profound mental changes by changing something in the brain. You implant this chip and it engages in whatever sorts of physical alterations are required to split your memory, your stream of memories. But that's all caused these two diverging personality types of different character developments and different love interests and increasingly different people from the outside. That's all caused at base from a change in your brain. And I think that that illustration is just one example of a much wider set of phenomena, which would be the dependence of our conscious lives on a functioning brain. And we see the opposite as well. That as the brain degrades, so do our conscious lives. Alzheimer's disease is probably the most vivid illustration of this that many of us encounter, where because of buildup of plaque in your brain, you slowly lose cognitive ability. You lose memory and cognitive function, and your personality changes uh, until you reach a point that your conscious life is almost non existent. And that's all because brain cells are dying and the brain shrinks. So, from the perspective, so do you think that that line of argument is a good one for seeing consciousness as necessarily connected to a brain, or do you not?
I think it is important evidence, actually. But we have to take that evidence into account of our total evidence. I was actually thinking about this topic just today when I was driving home from school. I was listening to the radio, and I somehow I started just kind of noticing that as I was turning the dials, I would hear certain voices, and then certain times I would hear just static. And I was like thinking about how that's kind of an analogy for the brain and consciousness that if the brain is functioning a certain way, then you get certain consciousness that emerges or is accessible or available, and then the brain changes in another way, and then maybe that consciousness goes away. In the case of like Alzheimer's, where you sort of lose that access. Well, in the same way as I'm like changing the stations, like some of the stations I don't have access to certain people talking. Um, But consider this. I mean, even though it's true that like the dial there on the radio is sensitive to me having access to certain dialogues or just static or whatever, I wouldn't say that the dialogue is emerging from the radio just on its own, right? It's like I understand that the radio is more of a device for accessing that reality, the reality of somebody having a conversation. And so, you want to think about different models of the brain and how those models might explain all the total set of data. So, there's a model. Okay, so just to kind of slow this down a little bit, we can distinguish between two major models. So, one model is brain basis of consciousness. The idea is that consciousness emerges from interacting particles or fields in a brain, and that's sufficient. There's nothing else that's required. That'd be like, you're going through the stations and you get the dial, and then people start talking just from the wires, just from there's no actual people talking behind the scenes. Like it's just the dial is just enough to generate that. Another model is sometimes called the receiver model, but I think of it more of as a facilitation model, where the brain is facilitating access to certain states of consciousness. So when the brain enters into certain states, then I have access to certain thoughts, certain feelings, certain emotional states. And when the brain moves away from those states, I don't have access to that. So there's a deep connection between the brain and my conscious states, but it doesn't follow that the consciousness emerges from the brain all on its own. And the reason why I say it's important to consider all of our data here is because we don't just have we have evidence that there's a kind of causal relationship between what goes on in the brain and then what goes on in your conscious experience. But we also have evidence of the causal relation going the other direction. That, if you intend to raise your hand, okay, that intention that you form in your mind, maybe you form a concept that's very specific, like 14, and then you form an intention, I want to raise my pinky 14 times, okay? And then here, there's this physical manifestation 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, so I got that very quick there. And that came from this thought. Now, you might say, well, what's the explanation of that? Maybe there's a physical explanation of that. But it seems like the mind is playing a role in causing the physical changes as well. So, I mean, if you have evidence of the brain states affecting mental states, I think you similarly have evidence of mental states affecting brain states. So all sorts of studies where gratitude affects your brain and leads to brain health. Mental health leads to brain health. Um, and so if that's right, well then what's the best model to explain this kind of two-way interaction between consciousness and the material brain states? If you just say that it's mindless matter at the base, then you have a causal exclusion problem, that the mindless matter causally excludes the mental from making a difference. But if instead it's not just mindless matter at the base, but you have mentality that's also able to causally interact with the physical, then you can make sense of causation in both directions. And just to be honest, my card's all on the table here. I really do think this kind of facilitation model or receiver model just better makes sense of more data. That it's just like with the radio. I mean, the radio, there's a correlation between what station and then I'm on and what I'm hearing, just like there's a correlation between what my brain state is in and then what I'm thinking and feeling. Um, but I don't think the radio is the full explanation of what I'm hearing. In the same way, I don't think the brain states are the full explanation of consciousness. I think rather that if you already have a conscious being, and going back to kind of the first part of our conversation, if you have a conscious self that is not constituted in its identity from atoms in motion, but is a more basic kind of reality that can exist and preserve its identity through time. If the conscious being is present, then you can have two-way causal interaction between mind and body. But if there's no conscious being present, then I don't think, in my view, that consciousness would ever emerge from molecules in motion. The molecules in motion affect existing consciousness, just as the radio affects existing information that's being transmitted through the receivers.
So before questioning that view, I think it's important to situate it in the broader context of mind body positions you might adopt and that are debated. You have this model of the brain as fundamental, and then another more interactionist model of the brain as receiver,
Yeah.
coordinating with potentially an immaterial self. But how does that distinction relate to the distinction between physicalist accounts of consciousness and substance dualist accounts? I don't think those are quite one to one, but I think it would be helpful to clarify what is physicalism broadly, and then what is substance dualism.
This is a fantastic question. I love this question so much because it's about how we categorize the views. And I think a lot of times when people kind of think about these views in the philosophy of mind, categorization affects how we even investigate the views. So in the popular culture, there is a kind of raging debate between the physicalists and the dualists, and everything kind of gets cashed out between those two sides. But I found it helpful to think about maybe other ways of categorizing the views. So, I mean, roughly speaking, the physicalist is going to say that the fundamental constituents of reality are physical, and then that either means everything is fundamentally physical or is physical, or everything is based in physics, right? So if you have a kind of non-reductive physicalism, the dualist is going to say that, well, in addition to the physical world, there's something else. But for me, I get puzzled about, like, what do you even really mean by physical? What is it? What is a physical thing? If you have a narrow definition of physical, well, what is that? Like, maybe it's something that is in space, and so then if you think numbers exist as abstract objects that aren't in space, then those things aren't physical. Sometimes philosophers work with a broader definition of physical, where it doesn't have to strictly be in space. It just has to be something that's amenable to broadly empirical inquiry, together with analysis of reasoning. And anyway, I like to just sort of leave it open what the word physical picks out, and then allow that even if we are physical beings, still we can recognize two-way causal interaction. That you can have two-way causal interaction, that on a broad notion of physical, you can have consciousness even being, in some sense, fundamental to the physical world. And then I think that has certain advantages. So, I mean, in my book, I kind of focus more on reasons to think that consciousness plays more of a role in shaping reality than many people think. And I even give an account for the physicalists of this view, this kind of mind first view. I call this mindful matter, the idea that matter itself has mentality built into it. And I'm happy with that. I mean, as long as we have a broad enough notion of matter and mind is playing a role in shaping reality, that fits very well with my own view of things. So I like to sort of avoid the unnecessary kind of debates and tangles that get in the thorns of how we define words, and just work with the kind of broad notions. I think what's really at stake for me is whether mind shapes reality. Mind really plays a role in shaping reality, or whether it's really mindless at the bottom of reality. That's kind of like the deeper distinction for me, whether sort of mindless is first or mind is first. That's what I care about, and my arguments are kind of designed around showing that mind is fundamental, and plays a role in shaping reality.
So typically, the substance dualist is taken to assert that there is the physical brain and then the immaterial self or soul, and that
Right.
I am either identical to my immaterial soul or I am identical to the composite object of my body and my soul. So, in understanding your view, this will be helpful. Do you think that if the body is annihilated, the self still exists?
Well, now it depends on. I want to, I'm tempted to just immediately say yes. However, I'm thinking about these fun and long conversations I've had with a friend, Andrew Bailey, a philosopher of mind, who's developed an animalist view. And his view is that you are contingently a body. So you are a body, but your body is not essential to who you are. And so when your body is destroyed, you basically transform. You continue to exist. And as I've talked with him about his view, I've so one of the questions is, like, do we have a substantially different view, or are we just kind of working with different concepts? Is it sort of a mere verbal difference? And I've never gotten very clear about that, whether our views are substantially different or not. So that's why I'm not quite sure. Basically, what I like to do is just kind of say, okay, here are the basic ingredients of my view. So I think that I exist. I think that a full description of the molecules in motion is not a full description of me because it leaves out that first person self awareness. I think that no matter how the molecules that compose my body are arranged or rearranged, they could be scattered across the universe. I would still exist. Okay, so I don't think that my existence depends on a material arrangement. So this would be basically to say, if I am something that we could describe as a material thing, then I'm a special kind of material thing because I don't depend on the particular arrangement of material parts. So then I could follow my friend Andrew Bailey. You destroy my body and the parts scatter. Well, I still exist. Um, I'm one thing, so I wouldn't call myself a substance dualist. I would say I'm a substance monist because substance dualists would say there's two kinds of substances: the material substance, which is the body, and the spiritual substance or the soul, which is another substance. I say no. There's just one. I don't posit in addition to the conscious substance, a material substance. Okay, so I'm taking it the other way. Materialists sometimes say, well, why posit in addition to the material substance, the spooky spiritual substance? I say, well, there's me. Okay, and I don't posit my existence. I just am aware that I exist. Or if I do posit my existence, if I'm going to posit my existence, it's going to be a posit to explain the consciousness that I'm directly acquainted with. I'm the bearer of that consciousness. So I exist and I'm a substance. And then I don't, in addition, because I'm going back to my simplicity principle that I want the simplest worldview that explains all the data in the best way. And so, I could be wrong about this, but as far as I can tell, I don't really need to posit, in addition to conscious beings like myself, some other kind of substance. I mean, there are various kinds of states, but I don't think I need another kind of substance, a material substance. So I think, I have an analysis of matter where matter is going to be analyzed in terms of certain states that ultimately are grounded in conscious substances, in my view. So I'm a substance monist. In that sense, I'm not even a substance dualist, but I'm a substance monist that you might say, it's not sort of a traditionally physical view because, I do think my substance continues to exist no matter how the atoms are arranged or rearranged. Does that make sense?
It's a hard view to understand, but it's one of those times where if I'm reading a difficult philosophy paper, I can tell that it's coherent and makes sense, but I know that to fully understand it, I'll have to read the paper again. Because it's so different. It's challenging so many assumptions that we bring to the table often when engaging in this debate, even in a professional setting among philosophers of
Yes,
mind.
it's true.
It's questioning fundamental assumptions like this idea that matter itself or the physical itself couldn't encompass fundamental mentality. I
Yeah.
wonder though if that view just renders that it construes the physical or the material so broadly that physical and material are no longer helpful terms on this account. And so yeah, we kind of have one substance left, but we purchase that at the cost of having we no longer have any intelligible sense of what kinds of things exist because physical no longer means much. It's just everything, including a situation where consciousness is fundamental. Well, then we seem to have lost any way to understand what kinds of substances exist. There's just this amorphous matter. Like what you know what I mean? So
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with that. I think that's a keen insight right there. How do we distinguish the different kinds of substances? Um, I think the way that I would sort of think about it is that, first of all, I mean, I am a little bit uncertain how to think of the word physical because I think it kind of depends on who I'm talking with. So I like to kind of ask the other person, well, what do you mean by physical? And I've noticed that people who describe themselves as physicalists tend to have a broader notion of physical. That through asking them what they mean by it, I find out, oh, well, your view is consistent with mine. Um, so, I mean, on their own account, but it's not so much because I have a good sense of the word physical myself. And I also think you make a nice point that if we have a broad category that encompasses everything, well, then we can sort of reinvent the distinctions within that category. So we have, you know, if everything's physical, well, we have physical things that are conscious and physical things that are not conscious, right? And so we can still kind of rediscover the categories in that way. And I think that that is an important point. Yeah. So, I mean, when I say there's one kind of substance, also, I think I am trying to say something a little more substantial, which is that I don't need this for my view, for my mind first view, but it is a view that I've come to, which is that um, the kinds of things that can have properties and change over time, those I'm calling substances. And those are the kind of things that I think also have a capacity for consciousness. There are other kinds of things that exist, like thoughts, visual images, uh, shapes, which I think are structures within visual experience. So I think visual experience has a kind of spatial quality to them, and those are real. Those are realities, and I think you could define physical in terms of certain certain structures that act according to certain laws and that are in the realm of space. But I'm going to analyze these in terms of states, states within consciousness, rather than as substances that have their own sort of identities and their own states and that persist through change. So this is getting maybe a little more advanced or sophisticated than I need to for my main view, but I do appreciate your point. We do have to kind of rediscover the categories somehow, and whether they're in terms of different types of states or even different types of substances, that's going to be a further project, I think.
Okay, so I have two questions because this
Yeah.
is quite interesting. The so in your account, I am this substance which is fundamentally conscious, and then I am squashed by a meteor. My body is gone, but I still exist. Where? What am I? What am I now? If not the conscious body, I'm the conscious fill in the blank.
Yeah, so you're the being, okay, and then the awareness is itself a spatial notion. So my working hypothesis is that spatial notions actually exist only within visual experience. I was persuaded by this slowly after reading Donald Hoffman's work, where he makes an argument that the spatial aspects of reality. Well, he kind of makes two different arguments that go together. One is that the spatial aspects of reality aren't fundamental aspects of the material world. So there's something that's more fundamental that gives rise to the spatial aspects of reality. And then he has this fitness beats truth theorem that he co-authored with some other scientists, where they deduce through calculations of probability that um, our visual experience that includes a kind of spatial structure is not likely going to correspond with the spatial structure outside of our visual experience. Um, it's not likely going to do that, and there's not like a survival reason for it to do that. It's not going to do that just by chance. And so this leads him to hypothesize that the spatial structures actually just exist within consciousness. There's not also spatial structures outside of consciousness. And so he thinks that even the sort of spatial universe itself is, there's not like a single spatial universe. There's rather beings that generate spatial imagery to interact causally in a fundamentally non-spatial reality. Okay. Now this is maybe hard. It kind of blows your mind, right? Because it's hard to think about reality as fundamentally non-spatial because we're so accustomed to thinking of it as spatial. But if you think about it this way, in our dreams, we can have experiences of moving around in space. Then we wake up and we don't think, well, that dream world like still exists somewhere. Well, where did I go when I woke up? Well, it's not that I went anywhere. It's I just had a change of consciousness. The spatial arena shifted. Now, my view is that you and I are operating in a sort of shared world where we have roughly similar spatial experiences, and these spatial experiences are systematically organized by causal structures that I'm going to call brains. Okay, brains are the causal structures for generating these systematically organized spatial experiences. And then the fascinating thing is that if you look at a brain, you will represent that spatial that causal structure as a spatial structure. So the causal structure of the brain generates a spatial representation of that causal structure, where the brain itself, the causal structure of the brain, is not fundamentally spatial. It's just represented as
Yeah.
spatial. So that basically, what you are most fundamentally is not a spatial thing, and even the causal structure that gets represented as a brain is not itself spatial. It's prior to the spatial reality, and the spatial reality allows us to interact with each other. And then when you quote die, as in your body scatters and your brain deteriorates, then you just have a change of experience. It's like waking up from a dream, basically. So you don't go anywhere, because the whole idea of where is a spatial notion that occurs within experience. So you don't go anywhere. You just change your experience.
Okay, so does the underlying causal structure that we are calling the brain, which is fundamentally non-spatial in this account,
Yeah.
does that survive the death of the brain and body as we conceive it? Or are you saying no, no, no? When you die, also the brain, that underlying structure dissipates too. It's gone.
That structure dissipates or changes radically. Um,
Okay,
so you
so
don't have access to this. It's like the radio. It's if you damage the radio, you no longer have access to anything. Oh well, anything that's being received from out there. So if you destroy your brain, the causal structure, you don't have access to
right.
this world.
Then how do we account for conscious experience post death in an afterlife or any kind of conscious experience after the demise of your physical body? Because the receiver model, this well, what is sometimes called dualism interactionism, but you don't have to affirm the dualism thing, but this interaction between mind and brain resulting in conscious experience, it seems that that would lead us to conclude that with the destruction of the brain there is no conscious experience, but that doesn't seem to be what you're saying. So why is it that the brain, like the receiver, like the radio, is required to, let me not mix metaphors. Why is it on this view that the brain is required for conscious experience while you're alive, but then once you die, it's like, oh, okay, now we can have fully developmental lives without the brain? Or have I
Okay.
misunderstood the view?
No, this is great. So it might be that part of the brain. Okay, so let me just make a distinction here, because I mean the term brain for me, it conjures up a spatial reality. If you know, if I see a picture, I've never seen my own brain, but like I've seen pictures of brains. Okay, so it's like there's a certain kind of like grayish pink tissue organized in a certain way in space. And so that spatial reality is not essential for my continued existence or for my consciousness, right? Um, however, the proposal that I'm offering is that that spatial structure is actually itself a representation of a more fundamental causal structure. Causal, I think of these as programs, basically, that allow and facilitate interaction in this world. And so, if I think about the total causal structure and call that the brain, the causal structure that allows interaction, and if that's completely destroyed, then I want to make a further distinction now between the part of that causal structure that's responsible for my access to a shared consciousness with you in this world versus the total causal structure that allows my consciousness like in any domain. Um, I need like an analogy here. It's like if we're playing a multiplayer game and we're all like plugged into like Minecraft or something, and we have our own screens, so we have our own access points to the game. And then through the rules of the game, maybe there's a way in which your avatar in the game can actually see within the game an icon that represents the rules of interaction of your icon in the game. This would be like a representation of your brain, your causal interaction in the game. And there's a certain rule in the game that if that icon gets destroyed, then you exit the game, and so people can't access your character anymore. Um, so let's just play this out. Let's say you're in the Minecraft world, and then your icon gets destroyed somehow. Zombies or whatever. Now you no longer have access to that game. The other players can't access you. I mean, imagine other people from around the world were accessing you. They can't access your avatar. You can't communicate with them. Um, but it doesn't mean that your consciousness is completely destroyed. It just means that now your consciousness has changed. It's like you no longer have access to that game, but maybe it's actually one of the rules of the game. You wanted a fully immersive experience where while you're in the game, you're turning off other algorithms, but when you're out of the game, now those other algorithms come back online, kind of like in the sort of classic near-death experience, where people report having consciousness outside the normal patterns within the game. I mean, like, I'm fascinated by the cases where people were born colorblind and then they have a near death experience, and then for the first time, they say they see in color during their near death experience, like they have this expanded conscious power when their brain activity is diminished and they're reporting seeing things from outside their body and they're seeing in color for the first time, and then they come back to their body and now they're limited again to the context of this interaction. So this is kind of a long set of ideas here, but there's a lot here. What I want to suggest is that maybe you have a lot of different causal programs, and some of them can come online, and some of them can be offline at different states. If you think of your brain as the total of all of your programs, well, then I guess if you destroy all of those programs, well, then you're just effectively unconscious. Um, but but I don't think merely destroying the spatial brain destroys all your programs, because the spatial brain just
Mm.
represents some of the programs for accessing this spatial shared reality. So you destroy that. That's like just destroying your icon in the in the Minecraft that we were playing. Your icon, your avatar got destroyed, but that didn't mean that now you are completely destroyed. You do lose some access to some things, but not everything. So I mean, this connects up too with the problem of like losing your intellectual powers when your brain goes away, and then if your brain completely goes away, why do you get more powers back? Well, because it might be that your brain is facilitating experiences in a certain state of limitation, and when that gets taken off completely, then it's kind of like exiting the vehicle. When you're in the vehicle, you're affected by the traffic. If another car hits your car, that will affect you. But if you leave the vehicle, then you're no longer affected by the traffic. If you leave those causal mechanisms behind, you may have other powers. That's at least left open on this account. Does that help at all, or does that make it crazier?
No, it's mind blowing. I mean, it's far more informative a theory of the self than typical expositions of substance dualism. And I think that's one of the objections to dualism that's often raised. And so I want to go through some of these objections with you and find out which
Let's
ones are
do it.
actually pertinent to your view and which are not.
Yeah.
But I think I understand it. I think I get it. One analogy might be a different one, and I want to hear from you if this is right, is to think of the radio as as divided into FM and AM signals. And so even if the FM signals and the capacity for the radio to pick them up is destroyed, you still have AM. So on this analogy, the whole causal structure that brings about consciousness is like the whole radio. And the brain that's responsible for conscious experience in this world and domain is like FM, the set of what I don't know how radios work, but the set of things that allows you to get FM radio signals. And if that's destroyed, well, you still have AM radio to listen to. You still have consciousness, just of a different kind. So that might be, is that one way to think about it?
Love that. That's a beautiful analogy. Yeah, thank you for that. Especially because it helps to illustrate that, if you're listening to FM and you're doing one station at a time, your experience is limited to that station, right? And then if that station's destroyed, right, that goes to static. It's like Alzheimer's. It's like you lost it. You don't have access to it. So it's a real significant thing. But it doesn't follow that if you lose all those capacities on the FM, that therefore there's nothing left. You can go to the AM, right? So I mean, every analogy sort of has its limitations, but I think it does illustrate a lot of what I'm trying to say here, that the causal capacities that you have to simulate experiences is not limited to those that are showing up manifesting as a spatial brain. I think the spatial brain is like, sort of the FM. It's giving you a certain range of experiences. But then, people in the near-death experiences, there was one case I thought was so fascinating. They said that they had this experience of leaving their body and experiencing some higher being. And the higher being was not like actually God. It was just like another being that had developed virtue of humility and compassion. And I just remember that the person was saying, "Oh, I want that virtue. I want that compassion. I want that humility. How do I get that?" And the being said, "There are things that you get, these qualities that you get only through the body, being in the body. Only." And my translation was only through coming into states of limitation, to going into FM, are you going to have certain experiences that will generate these through hardship, through states of limitation, through challenge. You're going to then be able to experience the development of virtue. Then when you move to AM, you basically leave this state of limitation, you come into this expanded state of consciousness. You're actually going to carry with you those virtues that you forged in the states of limitation. And it's really important that there's states of limitation where you don't have access to all the knowledge. It's part of what makes it the challenge. You don't have all your abilities, all of your powers that you could have outside of this state of limitation. So you can generate and develop, generate's not the right word. You can develop, inculcate those virtues through these experiences that are unique. Um, then your body scatters, and then you rediscover the powers you left behind, on this model. And that seemed to be what the near death experience was conveying. It's like, okay, it's not your time. And the person was like, okay, yeah, I want these virtues. Like, send me back. I want to go back into the state of limitation, because even though it's painful, even though it's hard, there's a challenge to it. It's worth it if I can generate. I keep saying generate, but you know what I'm trying to say. Develop these deeper virtues that can last within me, my soul, if you will.
I can imagine a traditional physicalist listening to this, a naturalist, and saying, okay, that's all well and good. I think you've secured the intelligibility of retaining consciousness, even in the face of the evidence we have for the connection between brain states and mental states. But all of this undiscovered, heretofore undiscovered structure you have to posit, these other uh, lines of communication like AM and FM, and this more literally the added structure of the underlying causal structure that generates consciousness that we don't have direct access to, and now we have to view the brain or the corresponding part of the brain that leads to that projection. That's just one part of the broader structure that is you, or that is your capacities. That's all very ad hoc. It's contrived. It makes the hypothesis here far more complex than the naturalist one that just says you're just the brain. Do you think these are costs to your view, that you have to posit these added structures that we don't directly observe by the nature of the case?
See, the way that I would think about it is I don't have to posit these. It's more that, I like to sort of, I like what you just said there about intelligibility. I like to kind of develop a working model to sort of test whether this is even a coherent theory. Um, so the way that I think about it is, I'm not positing my existence. I think that I'm able to be aware of myself. I mean, also in addition, I think there are theoretical reasons, if I weren't self-aware, to posit my own existence as well, to account for various things as the bearer of my consciousness, the thing that has my consciousness. Um, so I'm aware of myself, and then, as far as whether I should posit a brain in addition to myself, well, now I do have reasons to think that there's a kind of systematic element to my experience that I think is explained in terms of a causal structure. And I have evidence of the existence of brains. Again, even though I haven't seen my own brain, I've got evidence of it. And so I'm sort of thinking about it the other way, that actually positing the brain, which I think is a good posit, requires evidence. I think I have that evidence. Um, if I start to kind of go beyond, the existence of my brain and the causal structures, and start talking about these expanded states of consciousness, well, what I'm doing there is I'm trying to give a larger account that can explain a lot of types of data, but it's more of a working hypothesis. So what's more essential to my account is that I exist. I'm a conscious being, um, and for various reasons that we haven't exactly gone into, though we've alluded to that some of them in terms of what makes you you across time. I think I'm the kind of being whose identity isn't determined or grounded in just bodily states. And so, because of that, because of my self awareness of myself continuing, then I think that um, it's sort of reasonable to expect then that I'm not going to fall apart when the things that don't determine who I am dissipate. I think about this in terms of like generating thoughts in my mind. If I generate thoughts in my mind, my existence doesn't go away when the thoughts go away. And in the same way, when I generate visual images in my mind, my existence doesn't go away when the visual images go away. And so I just take this all the way out. Like, no matter what spatial changes happen, my existence doesn't depend on those things because my identity isn't tied to those things. So this is a reason to think that I continue to exist through any changes of material states. And then from here I can sort of infer, okay, well, how does this look? And then I give some complex story that it may sort of sound ad hoc if I'm needing that story for my account. It's not that I need it. It's just I can tell that story and it sort of makes sense of how things could go. Um,
Hmm.
it shows that it's at least intelligible, right? Because sometimes people make an intelligibility objection, like in principle, this can't work, right? So I'm sort of responding to that. I'm saying this makes sense, a working hypothesis, and I mean I have evidence that I think the account kind of best explains the evidence, but um, it's not required for my essential view.
Mm. I'm returning to an earlier interpretive difficulty with the view. On this account, what is the self? Is the self identical to the non spatial causal structure that you're referring to? Or is it still the case that conscious experience exists because an independent thing, the self, interacts with that causal structure?
I think the second, right, and it's because of the issues we talked about at the beginning, having to do with your identity being maintained through change. So even the causal structures can change, but then you are still you, right? Strictly you, one and the same you, through change. So that, I mean, that also opens it up so that you can have radical changes to the causal structures, and then you still exist. I mean, I have this idea that like if all the causal structures are removed, then you just have this kind of like pure, undifferentiated consciousness, contentless consciousness. To get contents of consciousness, particular thoughts, particular experiences, that's where structure has to take place. And so yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what is the relationship between the mind and the brain, and that this is why I've kind of worked this out, that there is an informational structure that allows you to have experiences in a systematic way. Systematic. It's not just random experiences. It's well organized. And the purpose of well organized experiences is to have a certain kind of growth that comes through experience, a kind of expansion of your soul, if I can use that language now. But what you are most fundamentally is prior to your expansion. You're the thing that expands. You expand through experiences. So yeah, I appreciate this question because I don't think that what you are just is the causal structure. I think you're the thing that has the causal structure.
Okay. So then to tie it back to the impetus of our discussion in Severance, what's going on in your view? I gather you're not getting multiple people, the innie and the outie, but certainly feels like that. So what is actually happening on this account of the self when Mark walks into the elevator, blinks, and it's 5 p.m. again, but internally they never leave? What's happening?
So if Mark refers to the self, the individual, then that individual has a radical change of psychology. You could use the term persona, which has the root word of face. So there's different personas, different faces, to pick out the different psychological profiles. And you could even then have different names for those different profiles, like the innie, the outie, and you could talk about them as different personas. In fact, you could even set it up so the different personas interact with each other. Maybe the innie finds out about the outie, but thinks of the outie as a different individual and then sends a message. They do. Okay, so I don't want to give it away, but I haven't seen this, so I can't give it away. But I can just imagine this, right? So you could end up having a relationship with yourself, okay, through the different personas. And that opens up a very interesting idea that you could have different faces of one substance or one self that allows that one self to actually have a kind of relationship with itself through its different faces. Um, but I would say that there's still one fundamental substance there, one fundamental self, even if it can undergo different faces or different personalities. So that would be my analysis. I mean, a lot of it has to do with vocabulary. If you talk about being the same person, what do you mean by that? Do you mean you're the same substance, or do you mean you're the same personality? I think our English language is kind of ambiguous there. I think we can talk about I was a different person back then. Okay, well, I mean, I think I was the same substance,
Right.
but I've changed my personality. So that would be my
Okay.
analysis. One substance, different personas.
Okay. More radical thought experiment, which will continue to shed light on the view.
Yeah.
And this is Derek Parfit's now famous thought experiment that he proposed in his 1984 book, Reasons and Persons. So, a surgeon splits your brain along the corpus callosum, separating your left and right hemispheres, and deposits each one into a separate body, each of which had no brain prior. And we know that you can actually have conscious experiences with just one hemisphere. So, these two bodies with half a brain then wake up and have some sort of conscious experiences. The question is, what happened to you? The you that was there before the split. Are you identical to one or the other? That seems arbitrary and plausible. Are you somehow identical to both? This like super composite of them? Well, that would be weird. Or did you die? To me, a third is the most plausible, but then what happens in cases of epilepsy where surgeons remove half of the brain and I don't know what they do with it, but they don't install it into another body. Well, we still want to think that the person survives. Anyway, how would you handle this? Obviously, any sort of views are going to struggle with this kind of a thought experiment, mostly anyway. So it doesn't necessarily mean your view is ought to be rejected. But what would you say happens?
Part of what makes this challenging, and I think this is the lesson of the thought experiment for me, is I think there's no way to really answer the question merely from a third person outside analysis. So if I see somebody experience this kind of, brain swapping and flipping and cutting and recombining, um, I'm not going to be able to determine from the outside like what what happens. From the inside. But I mean, there is sort of a fact of the matter. Like, imagine you undergo it, you experience yourself undergoing the procedure, and then you are sort of you have a certain kind of continuity of consciousness. You have sort of inside information, and so what I want to say is that actually the lesson of the thought experiment is that the third person physical facts don't exhaust all the facts about consciousness, about identity, because they leave open the question. Like, you can't answer the question just in terms of the physical facts. There's something else. There's an additional identity fact that remains unanalyzed in terms of the physics. Now, in the end, I mean, I end up saying that the identity is itself primitive. So, in a way, I don't give an analysis. So this is sort of my way of saying that, the mystery is sort of firm. There's no deeper analysis of your identity, but I still think that these are instructive thought experiments because they, I think, to me, reveal that the analysis isn't purely in terms or in virtue of physics. There's something else. There's a first person reality that's there, and so yeah. So I mean, I don't really know, as far as like what would be the case. Maybe it's like what you said. You just die. There's no you. You're gone. You're removed. But it's something. I mean, like, either there is you. You go to both. You go to one or the other. And whatever the case is, it's I think not determined just by the third person physical facts. There's something else. There's another fact left over. A kind of first person reality, first person fact of your identity. Um,
Okay, but your view doesn't lend itself naturally to one answer or another about what happens to you in this radical surgery.
Not my view of personal identity. I mean, I do think,
Mm,
just for other reasons, that you're not going to be both. I don't think like one thing would be both. It's sort of arbitrary to say that you're one rather than the other. So I guess it's either just annihilation or I don't know, splitting.
yeah. It's okay. All right, fair enough. Well, okay, to round out the discussion, which is now a little less pertinent that I now that I properly understand your view, but I thought I would just throw the common objections to substance dualism your way, and then what will be informative is we can find out whether they even apply to your view in the first place, or how your view would handle these
To
issues.
my substance monism. Yeah, right, right.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah,
Substance monism.
yeah,
So the first is the lack of information problem,
yeah,
but I think you've solved it. This is that on traditional substance dualist accounts, the soul is usually defined purely negatively. It's immaterial. For example, it's not material, but then you're
yeah.
still left wondering, well, what is it? What is this thing? And then people begin to get an idea of like immaterial stuff that the soul's composed of, which is probably incoherent. Related to it is that the body and brain and other physical objects are kind of robust objects of scientific investigation.
Yeah.
And then there's this question of if there really is this soul, why is it not amenable to scientific analysis? Will there be a science of the soul? Well, that doesn't seem right. But then why not? If it's a really substantially existing thing, I
Yeah.
gather these are less applicable to your view because yours has some granularity. But what do you think of this concern?
Well, yeah. So if we think of science narrowly, so that it's restricted to what we can discover through empirical means like through the five senses, then I think we have a problem even with science itself, because I think science itself requires introspective awareness of reasons from which you can make predictions from hypotheses. So you form a hypothesis, you can make a prediction that from that hypothesis, um, you're going to expect certain observations, but you need a kind of awareness in your mind of that prediction, that chain of reasons. And that's not, you don't get that through your eyeballs or through hearing or something. That's through introspective awareness of reasons. Um, so I think that if we think of science too narrowly, then science will kind of undercut the knowledge of science itself. But if we broaden it so that we can appeal to introspection and chains of reasons, then I think there's no problem with sort of self awareness or awareness of conscious states as being something that we can know about consciously. We can be conscious of our own consciousness. And so this allows us to give a positive account of a quote soul or a self, instead of it just being not material. I'm saying what it is. It's a conscious reality, and I know what a conscious reality is by immediate direct conscious acquaintance with my own conscious self. In fact, I would say that this is one of the sort of most knowable things. You don't have to infer your existence, whereas like the material brain is something that I do think I have a material brain. I do want to emphasize that, but I'm not nearly as sure that I have a material brain as I am that my conscious self exists, because my material brain is inferred through inference, through reasoning, whereas my own consciousness, I think, is known by direct awareness. So as long as our notion of science is broad enough to include these things that I think we can know, then we could say it's amenable to science. If we treat science narrowly, then I just want to say that we can then know things outside of that narrow definition of science. So let's not like trick ourselves in saying that, well, it's only known if it's known scientifically, and it's only known scientifically through very strict, narrow empirical means. That's going to, I think, be too limited, too restrictive.
Mm, okay. Again, I'm not sure how applicable this problem is, but the oft mentioned interaction problem. How is it that an immaterial mind can interact with the material or physical universe? What accounts for the causal interaction there? You do affirm some kind of causal interaction here, but it's not obvious that it's between an immaterial thing and a material thing. But I won't preempt you. Go ahead and say more.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's between, I guess, mental thing and
Mm.
other mental things, or material things. I actually have a paper coming out, um, for an anthology where I do a deep dive into this interaction problem, and I distinguish between different versions of the interaction problem. But basically, I make the argument that actually, in my view, the deep interaction problem is for the mindless first theorist who thinks it's mindless bits of matter that make up consciousness, because then you have the causal exclusion problem. If the mindless matter cause excludes the mind from making a real difference into the material world. But I think this sort of scientific and everyday evidence of mental causation, that you can intend to raise your hand and your hand goes up, there's some kind of causal relationship there. I think I can make sense of that if what I am fundamentally is a conscious being that has capacities to move things and generate things. So, I mean, I don't think this is required for my account, but I end up making an argument for mental causation. So, if I have an analysis of matter as analyzable in terms of informational states of mind, then mind body causation reduces to mind causation. So we have causation within the same category. So I don't face a lot of the same problems that sort of other theories that have very different categories. Even the substance dualism is sort of, there's two fundamentally different kinds of substances and they causally interact. I don't have that because I have one fundamentally unified substance, and the interaction is sort of within the realm of consciousness. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I want to say is there is causation, it's real, and every view, every theory has some kind of basic causal mechanism that's not explained in terms of something more fundamental. Everybody has that. I mean, if you have any causation at all, you have some kind of basic causal mechanism. So I think, just as my identity through time could be basic, I think there's some basic causal mechanisms, like maybe just the capacity to form concepts or intentions or to direct your focus in a certain way. That might be basic. It's not analyzed in terms of something else, but then you can analyze other kinds of activity in terms of the basic mental activities. And in my book, Who Are You Really? I have a whole chapter on this mind body problem. And I give a very detailed theory of how I think you can interact with your body in terms of these causal structures. So there's a lot more to be said about that, but I don't see it as an in principle problem from my view.
No, okay. Well, good. This is some good stuff. I'm thrilled with this discussion. It's been mind expanding. I think people will like it. And so, in my efforts to develop a signature touch or tradition for my channel, I am asking each guest at the very end just a more lighthearted question. And mine for you is, what philosopher or small number of philosophers have been most influential upon your life and thinking?
Great question. So Alvin Plantinga, when I was at Notre Dame, he was a gift to me. A lot of people know his work in metaphysics and the philosophy of religion as work that is deep and clear, but in person, he displayed a lot of insight for me. I remember coming to his office one time, and I had been thinking very carefully about some issues in the nature of perception, and I had some original ideas. I hadn't seen these in print, and I began to talk with Al Planning about my ideas, and it seemed like he immediately understood what I was talking about, had objections to it, and expanding ideas like instantly. No other professors that I was talking with about my ideas seemed to have that kind of quickness of understanding that Al Planiga had. And it very much impressed me. It was like, oh, he's the real deal. Like he's not just like really good on paper. I mean, he's really good like in person and he goes deep fast. So yeah, he impressed upon me the value for clarity, to seek clarity. I think sometimes philosophers work to be clever. There's sort of a tendency to be clever, and it's like, okay, well, let's be clear. And so that had a lot of impact on me. And Peter Van Wagen also, I would put him into the same category. He was my dissertation advisor, and he helped me to really see if I can translate all of my work in a kind of ordinary language, kind of like what you were saying before the show, that your audience, you want to sort of appeal to a broad audience, but also to the expert, but also to somebody maybe who isn't already familiar with the territory. And if you can do both, I think that's a very special thing. So both Flanagan and Van Wagen, in their own way, have influenced me to do that. And then finally, let me just point to my most favorite philosopher would be my wife Rachel. She's a not academically renowned philosopher, but she and I have philosophy conversations all the time, and she's expanded my thinking more than anybody in my own field. She's the one that I talk with the most, and she's very special in that respect. So, do want to mention her.
Well, it's very sweet. I I too have a very high regard for Alvin Plantinga. And though I never met him, he's had a substantial influence on me in terms of the way I think about philosophy and the way I do it, and the standards that I set for myself and for my philosophical investigations and my writing, my articulating. Well, I think it came out in 2012, but his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, that was 12 years ago. So I was relatively young. But I remember reading it and going, this is the thing. Not, okay, all of these arguments are sound. I've found a source of divine revelation. It was, this is the way to do philosophy because I can follow what he's saying. Some of this is challenging and dense, but I have such an appreciation for clarity. And he's one of the clearest writers in philosophy I've ever read. And I thought,
Yeah,
okay, that's my standard now. I
that's
may
great.
fail that all the time, but if I shoot for that, I'll go pretty far.
Yeah,
And so even though I haven't read everything he's written, I've read more from other people. I think in terms of me as a philosopher, he would be the most influential as well.
cool. Yeah, and he's also a fun writer. I mean, he's got a sense of humor that comes through his work
Yes,
as well. Yeah. So
yes,
sometimes
yes,
we
he
forget
does.
that, to have a little bit of fun. It's not just so serious all the time trying to chase the truth. It's like, oh, let's actually have
Yes,
some fun with this. So he's got a good sense of humor, which I love.
he does indeed. Well, try as I might to integrate that approach, reviewers for journals have been catching me every time and telling me to delete certain phrases every time. And so I'm like, all right, maybe I need more clout before I can
Hmm.
get away with that.
Wait till they accept the paper and then honor your revisions. You
Right.
just slip it in.
Okay.
I don't know.
I don't know. All right. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for coming on. Like I said, fascinating conversation. I think people are going to like this one. So thank you.
Thanks, Miles. Appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.